Okay, well, today's going to be kind of like Storytelling Sunday. We're going to camp out in one biblical story, but before we do that, I want to tell you some other stories first. So we're kind of cruising along in the Eat This Book Challenge. How you guys doing? Eat this book? Yeah, you're doing pretty good. So, we've been collecting stories. We asked, you to give us your email addresses if you want to get pestered or whatever. If you signed up for I'm going to eat this book and so on, and we're still counting all those pieces of paper because there were a lot. But we've just started to hear stories kind of percolating about what this is doing in the life of our community. I thought I would just tell a few of them here. So this is from one woman in our church community, and she says, I'm totally in for the Eat This Book Challenge. This is going to be so much richer than other times I've tried to read through the Bible because of all the pieces that have been pulled together here. I used to read the Bible when I was a teenager, but it's been 15 years since I've read the Bible with any regularity. Thanks for helping me get started again. And so I know this is a similar story to many of us. We're kind of like, yeah, I know I probably should read the Bible, but we never actually do. So let's just do it all together, and let's provide ways to help us do that. So it's cool to hear stories of people who are encouraged. This is from a high school student in our church community, and he says, I'm super excited to be participating in Eat This Book. As a senior in high school, I feel it will challenge me to help keep me accountable to reading the Bible every day. And I think that this will bring our already multi-generational church closer together. I can't wait to see how many people will do it. And so do we, when we get those pieces of paper counted, because there's a whole lot. Holy cow. There's another couple. This is cool. So my husband and I are loving the idea of this challenge. We're totally up for it. He's going to read through the Bible on his smartphone. I'm going to combine my iPad and the traditional read the paper pages of the Bible technique to complete the reading. So there you go, good old-fashioned read the paper pages of the Bible technique. We're excited for each week and for the resources to dive deeper. Thanks for your encouragement and support. Last story, it's actually very typical. We've been hearing lots of stories like this one. So my dear friend started attending Blackhawk with her family about a year ago. They didn't belong to a church previously, and her husband was quite a skeptic about the church and God altogether. I didn't know what I was expecting to see happen if they started coming, but they did. And I never imagined that they would end up joining a Bible study, decide to serve on mission teams overseas, and they have both committed to the Eat This Book Challenge. And my friend has rallied all of our old mutual friends to take the challenge too. And none of whom go to Blackhawk, all of whom live in other states in the country. This is amazing. So we've been hearing lots of stories about this, of just getting emails, or hey, I'm going to invite my friends or my family. I was corresponding with a guy in Texas last night who contacted me randomly. And he was like, hey, our family's doing this, and it's just great. So this is just kind of a cool catalytic thing in our church community. And we're excited to see what God does in the lives of our church community this year by meditating, by letting the scriptures form us every day. Yeah? It's good stuff? Yeah, it's great. So we're stoked to be doing it. So today we are continuing in our series in the first 5 books of the Bible that we're reading through in these first 9 weeks of 2012. We're reading through the Torah, which is the traditional Jewish name for the first 5 books of the Bible. And to give us an entry point, if you want to open your Bibles, you can turn with me to Genesis chapter 37. We're going to be telling part of the story of Joseph here today, Joseph and his brothers. But to do that, let me tell you one more story. After I read those stories, one more story before we read this story. We are in a 1-story building. No, 2 stories, or 2 stories. Can you find how many times I say the word story? Okay, I'm not going to use that one the rest of the day. There you go. Spontaneous, and it will stay that way. So there you go. So you see a picture up here of a flag of a country. Probably most of you don't know what country this is. Any takers? Anybody in the other rooms? This is the flag of the country Mozambique. Mozambique. It's southeast, on the eastern side of Africa. And it's a pretty large country, almost 23 million people. It's the only flag of all the flags in the world that has a machine gun as a part of the symbolism of the flag. And that might kind of strike us as, well, it's kind of crazy, but it's actually not funny. The symbol tells a story of the history of these people. So Mozambique was colonized. The people were colonized by Portugal a long time ago, and it was just in the 1970s, I think it was 75, the people of Mozambique gained independence and began to form their own government and so on. And very quickly, in 1977, a number of groups were vying for power, and a very bitter civil war began that lasted 15 years. From 77 to 92, and it was a very brutal, bitter war. A lot of people died. Machine guns are very much a part of the story of Mozambique. 1992, they gained independence, and there are people who are trying to pick up the pieces and build their future as a people together. 6 years ago, in 2006. A group of artists, Christian artists, who are Mozambicans, and they are part of a much larger art collective in Mozambique called Núcleo de Arte. And they got together and they wanted to start making art that would tell stories about their hope for their people and for the future of Mozambique, but through the lens of their worldview, through the lens of the gospel. And what hope does the gospel hold for their people? And so they made lots and lots of art during those years. And one piece has gained international attention. It stands in the British Museum today. And it's this big thing right here. It's a gigantic sculpture. It's called the Tree of Life. And it's taken from the image drawn right out of the beginning of the book of Genesis, which most of you read about earlier. And it's a big, tall thing. It's over 10 feet tall. And it's the tree of life, this image of flourishing, of divine life shared with humanity. And there's lots of creatures and insects buzzing and hopping around and so on. It's a very beautiful image. Now, the tree of life doesn't only occur in the book of Genesis. It occurs one other key time in the Bible. Not in the first pages, but you'll read about it in December. So in the last pages of the Bible. So in John, the visionaries kind of vision of the new creation, of the restored new heavens and earth. He envisions a city, but also a garden that's also a temple at the same time. And it's just a lot of imagery kind of melded together. And he envisions a river, and the tree of life is there. And he envisions the tree of life, he says, its leaves are for the healing of the nations. And so the tree of life in the Bible is a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of God's life restored to bring renewed flourishing to humanity. And that's what they are crafting as they made the sculpture right here. Now, that's cool, tree of life. What makes it most powerful is what it's made out of, which is probably what most of you are trying to figure out as you're looking at it. Right? What's this thing made out of? It's made entirely out of bits and pieces of machine gun parts. The machine guns that were used in the Civil War to kill people. Do I need to say anything more? This is very, very powerful image, right? This tells a story right there, doesn't it? So what's the story it's telling? Is that because of the resurrection of Jesus, because of the gospel and where God is taking our world, there's hope. The tree of life for the healing of the nations. But that hope does not cancel out or ignore the tragic violence and bitterness and selfishness and the tragedy of sin and death in our world. They go together. And it's precisely out of the tragedy that God weaves a new story and he makes something beautiful. This sculpture tells the story of the gospel visually, right? And it tells the story of the Bible. And specifically, it's a perfect way of symbolizing what's happening in the book of Genesis that we have been reading through. So keep this image in your mind as we jump into Genesis chapter 37. Let's get rolling. Verse 1. We're just going to read a lot of this story today and let the story kind of make its impression on us. Verse 1. Jacob, he lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. So let's first get a context here, big picture. So you remember, big story of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is God creates a good world, Humans mess everything up because of sin and rebellion, the fall, and the world just falls apart. So last week we talked about God's rescue plan. He's starting a new family through Abraham, a family of blessing, through whom blessing and salvation will spread somehow to all humanity through something God's going to do with his family. And so the promise, as you guys read through Genesis, the promise of blessing, it moves from Abraham, it gets repeated to his son Isaac, it gets repeated to his son Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel. So it's two names, but same guy in the story. And Israel means he struggles with God. Okay. Now, as you read through the book of Genesis, are these good guys or bad guys? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Good guys or bad guys? Right? So they're kind of both. They're like most of us, right? And that's the whole point of the story, is that we find ourselves in their story. So yeah, like they struggle to have faith. They make a lot of dumb decisions. And Jacob means deceiver. His other name means he struggles with God, right? This guy's a total chump, right? He's a cheat, he's a liar, he's a thief, and God sticks with him. You know what I mean? Not because God approves of his behavior, but because God is committed to working out his salvation in the midst of stubborn, stupid humans. And that's good news for most of us. You know what I'm saying? Like, we should read these stories and not be like, oh, like, what's wrong with that? Why would God, like, hang out with these people or bless these people or something? And he's like, well, he gave salvation to you. You know what I mean? He wants to give it to you. So come on, like, give these guys a break. Like, that's what we're supposed to do as we read these stories. This is our story. These are our mistakes that we read as we go through the book of Genesis. So this is the story. We're reading about Jacob's family here. Jacob has a bunch of kids. Here's one of them, Joseph. Joseph was a young man of 17, and he was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And so he made for him an ornate robe. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. They could not speak a kind word to him. So just again, this gets kind of complicated because Jacob has a really big family. So Jacob, chump that he is, right? How many women does he sleep with to produce children? How many wives does he have? He has 4 wives. He has 4 wives. Now again, there's an interesting discussion on Facebook pages, Blackhawk's Facebook page this week about what's up with like all these people in the Bible doing all these morally questionable things, and God's like blessing them. And okay, first of all, if you read a story in the Bible about somebody doing and we're like, well, that is so screwed up, does it mean that the story of the Bible is like promoting it or saying, yeah, here's a good way to live, just because it's in the Bible? No, it's actually, most likely it's in the Bible because the story's criticizing their behavior, right? So Jacob takes 4 wives, and how does that turn out for their family? The whole story is about their family disintegrating because of this. It's actually criticizing what he's doing here. And so, and how does this disintegration work itself out? So he has 4 wives, from whom come the 12 sons, and these become the 12 tribes of Jacob. Who does he love the most? Which wife does he love the most? Rachel. Therefore, he loves her kids the most, Joseph and Benjamin. And Joseph he loves the most for sure. So what does Joseph do? What does Jacob do for Joseph to show his favoritism? He makes the robe. Some of your translations might have the coat of many colors. Some of your translations might have the variegated colors or ornately embroidered or something like this. The reason why our translations differ so much is because nobody actually has a clue what this word means, right? So it's a really obscure Hebrew word. I think probably the best stab anyone has taken at it is by a guy named Andrew Lloyd Webber in the late 1960s. Yeah? So he the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And if you want to see one, just go to any high school in America and you can probably see it performed. So there you go. All right. What does this favoritism do to Joseph? What does it do to him? It has an effect on his character. What are we told in verse 2? We're told that he brings a bad report about his brother to his fathers. This is the same word used in the Proverbs, bad report, to describe gossip or slander. He's a little tattletale. That's what he is, right? And his brothers can't speak a kind word to him. He's like a punk, snotty-nosed little kid. That's what he is, right? To all his brothers. He's one of the youngest little brothers. And look what happens here. His character is revealed here in the next part of the story. Verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen everybody, this dream I had. We were out binding sheaves of grain out in the field. And suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. What do you think about that? So, sheaf. What's a sheaf? Anybody? I'm guessing most of us are not farmers. Here, refresh our memories. This is a picture of a sheaf. So you're out kind of gathering wheat. You tie it together in bundles, stack them together, that kind of thing. It's a sheaf. And he's saying, mine stood upright, taller than yours, and yours came and bowed down to me. How about that, right? And what happened? His brother said to him, what? You think you're going to reign over us? Are you actually going to rule us? And so they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. He just doesn't know how to stay quiet. Listen, he said, I had another dream. This time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Then he told his father as well as his brothers, and his father rebuked him. He said, what is this dream you had? Are your mother and I and your brothers actually going to come and bow down to the ground before you? And so his brothers, they're hopelessly jealous of him. But his father, he keeps the matter in mind. Okay, so this is the first piece here. When the biblical authors want to invite you in and share and challenge and teach you things about God, about yourself, about the world, the biblical authors never sit down, dear reader, let me tell you a thing or two about God, the world, and yourself. Something. They never do that. What do? They tell stories. They draw you into a world and then begin to shape the story to challenge how you think about yourself and God and so on. And so, where's God in this story so far? Has God been mentioned yet? No, it's just a story about a bunch of very dysfunctional family. That's what the story's about. Let's keep reading. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing their flocks near Shechem, so come on, I'm going to go send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go see if all is well with your brothers and the flocks and bring word back to me. And so he sent them off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, what you looking for? He said, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks? They moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Now, this is what's great about this little scene. You could totally take that out of the story, and you wouldn't miss it for a moment. You know what I mean? But it's just the realism. You could be an extra in the movie or something in this scene, right? So it's just great. It's good storytelling. So they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, which is just a big pit in the ground for water. Let's throw him into a cistern. Let's say a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But Reuben, he heard of this, and he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben, who's Reuben? What birth order does he come in? He's the firstborn. He's going to be responsible for what happens, right? So he's like, holy cow, I've got to stop this. So Reuben said this to rescue him from them. He was going to take him back to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe, the Technicolor dream coat that he was wearing. And they took him, and they threw him into the cistern. Now, just in case you're wondering, is Joseph going to drown? How's he going to swim in the water? The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Now, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up, and wouldn't you know it, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming down from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. This is the first time Egypt gets mentioned. This is where the whole family's going to end up. Judah said to his brothers, what are we going to gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? So come on, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites. Let's not lay our hands on him. I mean, he is our brother. He is our own flesh and blood. And so the brothers, they agreed. How gracious of them, right? So when the Midianite merchants came by, they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him down to Egypt. Okay, let's pause for a moment here and reflect. So this is a cool story. I mean, this is told well. This is great. This is kind of interesting in and of itself. But let's just pause for a moment here. Whenever you're reading in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament as you go through, you always have to ask, there's a story within a story within a story here. We're at the smallest level here, small level story here. But what's the big picture? Why do we care about these people? Like why are you going to read these stories about these brothers and so on? Okay, big picture. Genesis 1 through 11, the world's falling apart, humans are ruining it. God's rescuing the world through Abraham's family. And who's Abraham's family? These people. This is the rescue team. You know what I'm saying? Right? So we're like, what on earth? Like somehow God's going to bring blessing to all nations through this bunch, Like a bunch of two-faced, murderous, hypocritical, what? But this is exactly right. This is God's at work. Has God been mentioned in the story yet? Does that mean God's not at work? So God's silent in the story so far. It does not mean God is absent. It doesn't mean he's absent. Let's keep reading. Let's go over to chapter 39. Chapter 38 is rated R or NC-17. I'm not sure, so read it with your kids if they're going to read it, whatever. Okay, chapter 39. When Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. You're 17 years old. You've been kidnapped, sold to slave traders, taken to a country you don't know the language. You're now a house slave of a military captain. How do you feel about your life? So, my life's over. But the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of this Egyptian master. And when the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And so Potiphar put him in charge of his house. He entrusted to his care everything he owned. And from the time he put him in charge of his house and of all he owned, the Lord did what to the household? Potiphar. He blessed. What was the promise to Abraham? Through your family, blessing would flow to the nations. It's happening. It's spreading. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. And so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. When Joseph in charge, he didn't concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Okay, so of all the given scenarios, right? So you're a slave in a foreign country, you are trying to learn the language, but this is pretty good. This is pretty good. God meets him there. Does God solve all his problems? Does God intervene and teleport him back to his father? No. But he meets him in the midst of this very dark time in his life. This is the author's giving us a clue to how God is at work in our world. So who's responsible for Joseph ending up in this situation? Who's responsible? His brothers, right? His brothers. They meant to do him harm. They sold him into slavery. Does God want that? No, that's not good. But God's at work, redeeming, at work behind the scenes, weaving something beautiful out of the mess of human sin. The author's saying this is how God works. That's how it works. Let's keep reading. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. The biblical authors almost never tell you what people look like. You know what I mean? So modern novels, they'll tell you about the strapping young man or something, and he's muscular and rides a horse or something. And whatever, and they'll describe the shape of his nose or something. That never happens in the Bible. So it's always very, very stark economy of words that the author uses. They only tell you stuff that's important for the plot. So is it important to know that he's a good-looking man? It is important. Because after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." He refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. And no one's greater in this house than I am. My master's withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against whom? Does he say sin against Potiphar? Because that would be true, wouldn't it? But Joseph has a much bigger view of things. He says this is a sin against God. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Okay, let's just stop for a moment here. Just pay attention to something. It's very intentional in the author. The last time Joseph spoke, we heard words come out of Joseph's mouth. When was that? It was his dreams and how he brings gossip back to his father, right? The punk little kid, right? Is this a punk little kid right here that we're encountering here? Oh, no. Like, this is a changed man. This is a man of integrity. This is a man of honesty. He wants to honor God with every part of his life, every part of his body, right? Something's happened to him. And the authors, he's not just going to tell us, God uses hardship to teach you lessons or something like that. No, he's going to tell you a story. He's going to say, look at this guy. This was a snotty-nosed little kid who was like provoking his brothers. God used the hardships in Joseph's life to chip away at the rough edges, to do deep character formation in Joseph that maybe could have happened no other way. And so the sufferings that Joseph goes through are both the worst thing that's ever happened to him and the best thing that's ever happened to him. The story embraces that paradox of hardship in our lives. Let's keep reading. One day, Joseph, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. Dun, 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 dun. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand. It's a great little image. He wriggles out of his jacket, and he ran out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said, this Hebrew, he's been brought here to make sport of us. It's kind of dual meaning. It means to make fun of or to mock someone, but has sexual connotations too, this phrase does. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me. He ran out of the house. And so she kept his cloak beside her until master came home. And then she told him this story. This Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. And as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. This is not a guy you want to tick off, the captain of the military. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Okay, let's stop for a moment here, all right? So here's what happens in most of our minds when we read this kind of scenario. By the way, as God mentioned yet again in this story, God blessed Joseph, right? But in this scenario here, where's God? Is Joseph doing the right thing in this story so far? Yeah. Like, okay, he was a punk kid. He maybe had something coming from his brothers. Did he have this coming? He's doing the right thing. He's like the most upstanding guy you could imagine, the most godly man you could imagine. He's doing the right thing. And that's the reason why he enters into suffering and hardship again. He's doing the right thing. Now, most of us, we would look at this kind of story, or when this scenario happens in our lives, we go, I'm doing the right thing, and my life falls apart. And what's our first instinct? God's nowhere to be found. He's abandoned me. He's not good. He's asleep at the wheel. He's not in control. That's where we first go. And what this story is saying is it's precisely the opposite. It's precisely the opposite. Things are not out of control. Now, who's responsible for Joseph's getting in trouble here? Is it God? No, it's Potiphar's wife. It's her sin and selfishness. God did not cause that. But God can redeem it. He can use it. He can weave it into the story. He can bring a tree of life out of machine guns. And so what happens? He ends up in prison. But while Joseph was there in prison, this is verse 20, The Lord was with him, showed him kindness, granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And we've heard this story before, haven't we? Right. And so every time Joseph, again, you read through the story, he gets into hot water again and again and again. Because he's doing the right thing, God's at work behind the scenes and so on. See, what the story is getting at is that life is very ambiguous for most of us. Sometimes we end up in difficult scenarios because we had it coming, We had a role to play, like the snotty-nosed punk little kid. And maybe we didn't get the full, we don't deserve everything that happened to us, but we had a role to play in it, and we need to own up to that. But other times, things happen to us that we had no role in. Just hardship, tragedy, someone wrongs us. And we say, where is God? And the story is saying, no, hold on. Just because hardship hits you square in the face does not mean God's not around. There could be a bigger story. And so for Joseph, we get to see that bigger story come to its completion. We don't have that luxury in our lives most of the time. But for Joseph, we do. Turn to chapter 50 with me. Chapter 50. So Joseph's crazy set of circumstances. If you're on the reading plan, you'll read through it, finish reading it this week. He ends up, through a friend of a friend of a friend, meeting the king of Egypt. He becomes an advisor to the king of Egypt, and he guides the country skillfully through a time of famine. And he saves the lives of tens of thousands of people from starvation. And so lo and behold, who should come wandering into his court one day but who? His brothers, right? And it's an exciting story. You got to read it. So then he reveals himself to his brothers, gets his family to come down. He's reunited with his father, and it's a tearjerker scene. Everyone cries. And so then his father finally dies, passes away. Jacob passes away. Look at verse 15 of chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers, when they saw that their father was dead, they said, now, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him? And so they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left us these instructions before he died. They're back at it again. You know what I'm saying? Like they haven't learned their lesson yet, right? Joseph is daddy's favorite, so okay. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants of God, the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to Joseph, what is his response? He weeps. Man, these guys don't get it. They don't get it. His brothers came and threw themselves down before him. We're your slaves, they said. What are they doing? They're bowing down to him. And Joseph said to them, okay, what would the snotty-nosed punk little kid Joseph say? Right? He'd be like, yeah, that's right. You know what I mean? Like, you better bow down. But what does this Joseph say, who's been changed and shaped by his hardship? He says, you guys, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Look, you intended to harm me. That was fully your intent. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, to save many lives. Okay, let's just stop right here. There's a reason why this is at the very end of the book of Genesis. Because the author's saying that, dear reader, if you haven't clued into what this book's about, here you go in a sentence. So that's what the book's about. That's what the whole story of the Bible is about. Is God responsible for Joseph going through his hardship? What does Joseph say? No, his brothers are. You intended this for harm. But God is at work. He didn't allow your evil to thwart his plan ultimately. He's working it out behind the scenes and so on. So author's trying to invite you to take a view of how God works in the world. And it's not a view that most of us would prefer, right? So we prefer the version that's going to happen in the book of Exodus, where God sends fire down on the oppressor. You know what I mean? And I like that story because it's simple, it's clean, right? This is not clean. This is not simple. This story embraces all the ambiguity of our day-to-day lives and struggles to have faith with God's promises and his presence and so on. And so the story just simply says this. It says, listen, man, your story's not over. You don't know what God is up to. And you may or may not have the luxury of finding out the tree of life that God is weaving out of just the machine gun bits of your story. And so this is what the book of Genesis, it lobs this ball at each of us, and we can choose whether or not we're going to take it or not, whether or not we're going to accept this view. Are we going to boldly take a step of faith and say, God did it in the life of Joseph. He did it in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. He has something in mind for my story too. There is a purpose, and I may never find out what it is. This is very powerful, because there's many of us here, we're like in prison with Joseph right now. We're in the pit, or we have people that we love deeply, and they're in the pit, and we're just wondering what on earth is going on. And this story is not trite, it's not simple. It's embracing the difficulty and the struggle, and it's just saying, will you boldly trust in this God of the Bible who's at work in ways that we don't know? Can you trust? Can you trust that he's doing something in your story, shaping you, bringing a tree of life out of death? So I don't know how this lands with you, but this is the word. This is the summary. This is the book of Genesis to us. God's at work in our world. And it doesn't mean he solves all of the problems instantly or intervenes the way we would like him to, but he's redeeming. He's at work. So I don't know where this lands with you today, but this is God's word to us as a community as we finish up the book of Genesis this week. And so we've got some time here at the end of our service for prayer, for reflection, for song. And some of us just need to camp out right here and do business with God about what's happening in our lives. And I just encourage you to wrestle with the time that we have here today. Let me close us with a word of prayer. Father, I pray for all of us here, my brothers and sisters. You know every story that's sitting here and in the other rooms as we're gathered as your people today. You know those of us who are sitting in the pit and in prison with Joseph, and we don't know, we can't see the bigger story that you're weaving. God, I just pray that you're present as you were with Joseph, that your presence would be real and tangible to those of us who need it here today. And as we go out from the gathering today, we just ask you to speak to us and speak hope because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And we pray in his name. Amen.